Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Climate change is readily apparent this year, generating surprising heat waves in the Pacific Northwest, scores of wildfires across the West, and an ongoing series of tropical storms and hurricanes spinning out of the Atlantic and barreling into the east and Gulf coasts of the United States. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at National Parks Traveler. The effects of climate change aren't absent from the national park system either. To discuss some of those impacts, we're joined by Frank Dean, President and CEO of the Yosemite Conservancy, and Cory Goehring, the Conservancy's lead naturalist. Welcome to the Traveler, guys.
Thank you, Kurt.
Now, Frank, you've been at the Yosemite Conservancy since 2015 after a long career with the National Park Service. I'm guessing you've seen more than a few impacts of climate change, both during your Park Service career and now at the Conservancy and your work in Yosemite.
That's for sure, Kurt. I mean, we just see that the summers are getting hotter and longer, and wildfire behavior like we've never seen before. I was a wildfire fighter as well, and it's just behavior is just so different as we speak. The fires in Lake Tahoe today are just coming. It's actually the second time in history that a fire has crested over the top of the Sierra, and the first time in history was 2 weeks ago from the Dixie Fire. So it's just unprecedented kind of behavior.
Yosemite's kind of been spared this year, somewhat when you look up north to Lassen Volcanic and how the Dixie Fire roared across that. But certainly in the past few years, Yosemite has really been impacted either by actual wildfires in the park or the smoke coming over from some of the fires to the west of the park and south of the park.
Yeah, Cory might know, but I think there's several lightning strike fires in the park in Yosemite, but they're relatively small. They've not kind of grown in huge size. So we've been fortunate in Yosemite this year. Is that right, Cory?
Yeah, that's correct. We've mostly had small, as you said, lightning strike fires that are burning low and slow through the forest, which are the good fires that we want to see. We haven't seen any large mega fires or hot and fast fires starting here in the park this year.
Now, some people might say, well, geez, it's summertime. We always have wildfires out west. How do we know that climate change is really driving these more so than it has in past years?
Yeah, that's a great question. Fire is natural to the landscape here. Fires existed in the West for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, millions of years. But what we're really seeing change is the types of fires that we're having. A good fire, a healthy fire here in California is a fire that burns low and slow through the forests. And unfortunately, what we're seeing because of human-caused climate change are the drier environments with heavier fuel loads on the forest floor that are causing these hot, fast fires, these mega fires that are burning through the forests and essentially destroying ecosystems.
I know up at Lassen, they were telling me that the moisture levels in trees were just incredibly low. And the combustibility was incredibly high, 95 to 99%. Do you see similar situations in Yosemite?
Well, for sure, because we're south of Lassen and it's even warmer, and Sequoia National Park to the south of us has seen even more extreme conditions in recent years, as we know from the Creek Fire and the fire in the Sequoia National Monument last year, where it was devastating.
Now, are you seeing things bounce back? I know, I'm an old guy. I was on the ground in Yellowstone back in '88, and by that summer, I was seeing, the fireweed coming back and things greening up. And in the park recently, it's amazing how quickly the lodgepole forests, relatively quickly, how the lodgepole forests have come back, not only from the '88 fires, but from more recent fires. Is climate change, can you tell whether it's impacting how these burned areas are coming back?
Yeah, we can definitely see that in a lot of the fire followers, especially in plants that are well adapted to these fire ecosystems. Where the real effects come in are where we can see different wildlife, such as Pacific fishers. Pacific fishers are highly impacted from these major fires that cause habitat loss. In fact, recently, as of May 2020, Pacific Fisher was just put on the federally endangered list, primarily because of habitat loss driven largely by wildfires.
Now, earlier this year, the Traveler, we reported on how climate change has impacted giant sequoia trees in California and in Sequoia and Kings Canyon and also in Yosemite. The Conservancy, you guys are helping the Park Service investigate what is killing the trees, right?
We are. There's a few grants this year and last year that we've been providing to not only Yosemite, but a little bit of help to the Sequoia National Park as well. Obviously, there's a lot of landscape scale issue here with sequoias across the Sierra. We're trying to figure out through the Park Service, really, with the support of our donors, is what's the effect from the drought. And it looks like the recent results are showing that despite a couple of blips of decent winters in the last 10 years, the sequoias are reacting to a 10-year drought cycle right now, or a period of 10 years. So that's causing beetles and other pests to have more of an inroads to the trees when they're more vulnerable. And then, of course, with the drought conditions, they're more susceptible to wildfire, particularly if there's not been some incremental fire allowed into the grove to clear out the duff and so forth. So yes, some people are saying it's, they call the giant sequoias the granddaddy trees. They call them the monarchs. So some people are saying this is the end of the monarchy because you had such a devastating loss last year with the fire in Sequoia National Monument, where about 15% of the total sequoia trees in the Sierra were wiped out.
What are you seeing in Yosemite? I mean, they're such huge trees. Do they show signs of distress? I know here in the Rocky Mountain region, the inner part of the Rockies, that the aspen trees really are showing the distress of a lack of moisture this year. Do sequoias have any outward signs of distress?
Or you might know that from what I've heard, in the crowns of the sequoias, we're seeing browning and some dying off in the crowns, which was surprising because we always thought these trees, we used to joke they're too big to fail. They've been around for 2,000 years. Nothing seems to get to them. But in recent years, we've seen otherwise healthy trees starting to brown in the crown. So that's a sign that they're stressed.
Yeah, and I think we're definitely seeing, browning in the crowns. And as Frank was saying, just in Yosemite National Park alone, we've seen in recent years 7 sequoias die here in Yosemite National Park, 30 sequoias throughout Kings Canyon and Sequoia. And so these are trees that have survived for thousands of years, the monarchs of the forest. So studying what's happening to these trees, I think there are answers that we're still going to find by studying sort of what's happening right now, not only with lack of moisture content, but I think a big contributing factor too is the lack of snow levels that we're seeing at the elevation ranges that sequoias grow in. These are trees that can absorb 500 gallons of water a day in their spring growing season. And if that snowpack isn't there isn't the water for them to absorb in that growing season.
Those 7 trees that died in the park, what did they die from? I know you had a wind event earlier this year that blew some over. Is that the 7 you're referring to, or?
Yeah, we're doing studies right now actually to determine, was that because of drought? Also studying, could it be insects that might have brought these trees down? Yosemite Conservancy is funding right now research of looking at some of the samples of branches that have fallen during the Mono wind event in January and seeing, if it was beetles that got into the trees before the wind event, or if it's beetles that got into the trees after the limbs have fallen down. So it's continuing research that we're keeping a close eye on.
You guys also, I believe, are funding research into white pine in the park, another majestic tree that has a long history with the growth of the United States as a country. Back east, they were harvested for the masts of ships. What's the situation with white pines in Yosemite?
Yeah, white pines are a species, found above 10,000 feet here in Yosemite. It's also a species that can live over 1,000 years, and they play a vital role.
Just a second. So we're talking white bark pines, not white pines?
Oh, sorry, white bark pines. Yes.
Okay, I was confused. Okay. Don't have white bark pines back east.
Okay.
So white bark pines, what's going on with them in Yosemite? The Methuselah trees.
That's right. Yeah, the white bark pines species live over 10,000 feet in elevation here and can live over 1,000 years. And they play an important role here in the ecosystems. Not only do they provide protection against erosion, they also help regulate snowpack. And they also rely on a bird species here, the Clark's nutcracker, one of my favorite birds, Lucifraga columbiana. And Clark's nutcrackers help disperse seeds of the white bark pine throughout the range. And we're seeing a die-off of white bark pine, not only because of drought and because of increasing temperatures, but also because of blister rust, which is a large concern. So Yosemite Conservancy is funding research of collecting seeds from the white bark pine and trying to find genetics of certain white bark pine that might be more resistant to blister rust.
Right. I know they've been doing similar work in Yellowstone, where the white bark pine is also particularly important for grizzly bears. The seeds are a very high protein, calorie-rich seed that the bears rely on. And are you seeing much success in cultivating blister rust resistant trees?
I think it's too early to say. They're just starting this project. And but it does kind of bring up an interesting point I wanted to make, Kurt, about NPS, National Park Service policy. As you probably know, in the last 50 years or so, the sort of the philosophy overriding has been let natural processes prevail and don't intervene. And this is kind of a pivot from the old days of feeding the bears and, sort of more maybe well-intended, but maybe not as science-based kind of park management. So now we have a situation where in the 60s, before I was a ranger, they had blister rust crews that would come in and try to eradicate this non-native, scourge that was affecting the pines. I'm not sure how effective that was, but now with climate change, you kind of wonder, how does the park square that policy? If the natural processes are prevailing, but they're man-induced, climate change is really accelerating the change. Does that cause the Park Service to intervene more than maybe they would normally? So, sort of extreme example would be, do you irrigate the sequoia trees? Do you kind of provide more water to get them through this period? Or, in the case of fires in the grove, the Mariposa Grove, for example, has been treated every year. There's some small management fire that's allowed to go in there to reduce fuel at the base of the trees. That has not happened at the Merced Grove, the smaller grove in the park, but we're going to start doing that next year to protect that grove as well. So it's an interesting question, with glaciers retreating, Joshua trees maybe threatened, and these iconic species that are the namesake of national parks. What does park management do over the next few years as climate change starts to really take hold?
You raise a very interesting topic that has come into my attention with what's going on at Isle Royale National Park, where you had the wolves basically dying off because we weren't seeing the ice bridges that would allow new wolves with more diverse genetics enter that ecosystem. And so you had the Park Service deciding to, in effect, manage that ecosystem, not let natural processes proceed and bring in wolves. And did that go against the general principle that you let natural processes proceed? And with climate change, I've heard the argument that, climate change is driven by man. That's not a natural process. And so, yes, we should do what we can to mitigate it. But where do you draw the line?
Yeah, it'll be a challenge, I think, for future park managers as it becomes more obvious and evident that like if we see dramatic decline in sequoias, for example, it'll accelerate this conversation.
No doubt. And when you talk about climate change, you can't help but talk about refugia. I mean, we're kind of touching on that now in away. Refugia, places where species, both plant and animal, possibly can escape climate change impacts. I know over at Devil's Postpile National Monument, south of you guys, the park superintendent, I interviewed her some years ago, and she was working on their general management plan, and part of her intent was to see that the monument provided refugia, because it did seem to be a cold sink of places that perhaps could withstand it. What work is the Conservancy doing in exploring places in Yosemite that might be refugia for species such as the fishers?
Well, there's been a lot of wildlife research that we have funded through our donors in recent years in the park, and we don't really talk about it in the light of climate change, but these are species that are kind of on the edge. The Sierra Nevada red fox and the fishers and so forth that are really small in numbers. So we really want to know more. How many of them are there? Where are they at? What can we do to protect them and allow them to thrive? And bighorn sheep is another species that was reintroduced by us in the Park Service just a few years ago to the central part of the park. For the first time in 100 years, the bighorns are back in the center of the park. More recently, there was Sierra Nevada red foxes, where we had a sighting and then cameras in the winter that were posted on trees, and they were noticed. And then last year we had scat dogs that went in, and they were able to find the scat of mountain lions and red foxes and actually determine down to the individual animal how many animals and red foxes there were. So it's pretty amazing what's possible these days. So it's all about finding out the facts, the research, and so forth.
What is a scat dog? I'm sure a few listeners aren't familiar with that.
It's a few dogs that are trained specifically to scent out mountain lion and red fox scat. And so, it's amazing what they were able to do by patrolling this section of the northeast corner of the park and finding where these animals were. And then when you find the scat, bring it back to the lab, you can really learn more about the animals. And they actually also determined there was some presence of the red foxes south of the Tioga Pass Road, which we didn't think they were that far south on the boundary. So it's pretty exciting that we're able to learn more about it.
Is it a particular species of dog, or just different species that are trained to detect this type of scat?
I can't remember. I don't think there was a specific species that it was tied to. It was like a bloodhound kind of a dog.
Interesting. We're talking today with Frank Dean, the president and CEO of the Yosemite Conservancy, and Cory Goehring, the Conservancy's lead naturalist. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
Whether it be strategy, business planning, change management, board development, executive search, or diversity planning, Potrero Group is here to help. They mix a depth of experience in the parks and land space with a breadth of best practices from other industries. For more information or to schedule a preliminary conversation, go to potrerogroup.com, P-O-T-R-E-R-O group.com. The North Cascades Institute has a large portfolio. It's an environmental learning center, training center, conference center, and leadership center, all set in the splendor of the North Cascades National Park Complex. Learn more at ncascades.org. Nova Scotia, 8,000 miles of coastline dotted with colorful fishing villages, quaint coastal towns, and an abundance of scenic natural beauty. Home to 2 national parks, Cape Breton Highlands and Kejimkujik. Spend your nights under a canopy of twinkling stars. Spend your days exploring trails, beaches, historical waterways, and tons of cultural and recreational experiences. Visit novascotia.com today to start planning your natural getaway. Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to raise private support to deepen everyone's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at WNPF.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org.
We're talking today with Frank Dean, President and CEO of the Yosemite Conservancy, and Cory Goehring, the Conservancy's lead naturalist. For those not familiar with the Conservancy, it is a nonprofit organization that raises money to help out Yosemite National Park staff in a wide range of activities, from research to restoring the Mariposa Grove of sequoias, species monitoring, a whole bailiwick of work that you do there, Frank. How do you decide what to do?
Well, the way we work on this is, and we're joined at the hip with the Park Service. We're partners. And so, in fact, next week we are looking at our grants. Park submits a list each year to us in the fall for grants for the following calendar year. And these are their priorities that they've vetted as a management team, and they decide what they think we could use some help on. So it's pretty exciting. We just got the draft list today, and we're going to be working on that with our committee. A subset of our board is a committee that reviews these each year. So the nice thing about it is the priorities kind of are set by the Park Service, but then we determine what's fundable through donors. Some things are maybe a tougher sell than others, like wastewater plants or something like that. But
I was going to say
parking lots. But the park has sort of learned what's appealing to us, and so it's a pretty smooth operation each year. This year it's about $12 million in support that we're providing to Yosemite National Park.
That's incredible. And you go back to the restoration of the Mariposa Grove, and I think you guys contributed $20 million towards that, correct?
That's right, $20 million, and the park matched that with federal funds. So it was the biggest project to date for us, and total transformation of the Mariposa Grove experience.
Well, let me ask you a difficult question, perhaps, Frank. I mean, you're on both sides. You worked for the Park Service for a long time. Now you're working for the Yosemite Conservancy. You guys raised, $20 million for that one project, the Mariposa Grove. You go across the country over to Grand Teton National Park, and the Grand Teton National Park Foundation raised upwards of $20 million for the Jenny Lake area and restoration of the trail system up there and the front country footprint. Is that something that friends groups should be doing? Isn't that Congress's role to see that these areas are maintained properly? And shouldn't Congress be giving the Park Service the funding to do this?
Well, ideally, the park should be, fully funded to the extent that is needed by the federal government. They are federal areas. But as parks are not as high a priority as with all the demands and the needs that the country has. So whether it's social services or national defense or education. So parks have done pretty well from the funding standpoint on the federal side, I will say. There's this new Great American Outdoors Act fund that is really capital spending, backlog maintenance. And again, those are projects that are probably not in our wheelhouse. There is literally a wastewater treatment plant on that list for Yosemite, and major renovations to the Ahwahnee Hotel, structural seismic renovations that would be beyond our means, to be honest. So I think it's or redoing the Glacier Point Road. So these are federal, inherently federal projects, and they're going to take care of those finally. What we do is try to make the difference, where that sort of distinction is. The Mariposa Grove was always a gleam in the eye of park managers to try and restore, but it was a little bit beyond their grasp, and it was beyond our grasp too when we first started. But together, over time, we were able to make that goal. So I think that it's good to have the partnership. Again, we can also bring maybe some of the best design to the table. We're not beholden to government contracting processes, and we can bring in sort of fresh eyes and talent to look at an issue and a project to the park and do it quicker. So I think there's some, we both have our strengths, and it seems to be working well.
One of the unique things that the Conservancy has going for it is you don't rely on retail sales to generate the funds that you turn around and give to the Park Service. You have cultivated a very wide and dedicated core of donors who believe in the work that you do and the work that you're able to do in Yosemite.
That's true. And our business model has been fortunate during the pandemic because even though our retail stores were closed, our stores are relatively small compared to the concessioners. So most of our revenue comes from our loyal donors. And it's we're fortunate that we have such a great cause in Yosemite, and people love it and they want to help it and they want it to be there when they go back and visit again. So we didn't miss much of a beat last year, and so we're fortunate. We did have it. We took a hit on our retail side, but it was more than offset by the donations.
Now, going back to climate change and its impacts on the park and the resources in the park, some of the work that you've been able to finance is studies into amphibians and possible refugia, I believe, in Yosemite, as well as bird species. Cory, what can you tell us about that work?
Yeah, that's some of the most exciting work that I think Yosemite Conservancy has been able to fund. Since funding this year in 2021 and many years prior, we've funded amphibian research into endangered species such as Yosemite toads, yellow-legged frogs, and then also another species not endangered, but the red-legged frog. So really exciting work that we've been able to team up with not only the National Park Service, of course, but also with the San Francisco Zoo as well. So we've looked at yellow-legged frogs that have used to be prevalent throughout the High Sierra here, but with the introduction of fish into High Sierra lakes, which are actually non-native, we've seen sharp declines in yellow-legged frogs. And we've been able to team up with the San Francisco Zoo to raise yellow-legged frogs and reintroduce them to some of the high alpine lakes. Also with that, Yosemite toads as well. They're a target species that have been found to be especially vulnerable to climate change and drought. We're funding studies on those to see how they're being affected. And a real success story, I think, is our red-legged frog research that we funded, and also reintroduction. Red-legged frogs were reintroduced in 2016 with support from donors. We turned our attention to this species because it's a species that's actually been absent from the park for half of a century. This is the red-legged frog that Mark Twain wrote about, the jumping frog of Calaveras County.
Right.
And
right.
yeah, but yeah, through donor support, we've been able to raise red-legged frogs at the San Francisco Zoo and bring them here to Yosemite, and reintroduced thousands of red-legged frogs to Yosemite. And this is a real success story. As we're seeing amphibian populations decline worldwide, we're seeing red-legged frogs coming back here in Yosemite National Park.
We had a story a few weeks ago about non-native invasive fish in the park system, and one of our readers was surprised to learn that a lot of the High Sierra lakes never did have fish originally, and they were brought in to give anglers another destination. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So I imagine to you have to remove those fish from the lakes, right?
They do. That's been a little controversial, but just even a few people on our board that like to fish. But it's yeah. I mean, you just pick certain lakes and they do eradicate the fish there and make it safe for the frogs to come back. And as you said, Kurt, above the rim of Yosemite Valley, there pretty much were no native trout in Yosemite. So Fish and Game years ago started dropping fish out of planes into those lakes, and actually started with the Buffalo Soldiers and the Army early rangers with coffee cans of trout fingerlings, and they would dump them out on their patrols into creeks and streams, lakes.
And so now you got to go out and remove those fish and then bring in the frogs and let frogs do what frogs do. What about chytrid fungus? Is that still a major concern out there?
Yeah, definitely a major concern. We've seen lots of effects of chytrid fungus on our amphibian populations. We've actually funded scientific research to determine through DNA, through environmental DNA, areas that we can reintroduce frogs that won't be as vulnerable to chytrid fungus. So really seeing some fascinating research in that department.
That is amazing.
So some of the yellow-legged frogs are resistant to it. So they're able to identify those and actually help rear them in captivity and then get them back into the lakes.
It's amazing. And with climate change, it's affecting habitat of native species, and you're seeing invasive species move in, and I've always wondered how long it takes an invasive species to become a native species. What's going on with bird habitat in Yosemite? Is climate change greatly impacting the conditions there for your native species?
We are seeing climate change affect, habitat of native bird species. This year in 2021 and prior years, Yosemite Conservancy has been funding MAPS research programs here, determining bird population and shifts in populations and shift in migration patterns here. We also funded research for spotted owls to just see how spotted owls react to these large wildfires that are burning through our forests and how populations react to that. So yeah, there's continuing research on how climate change is affecting bird populations here in the park.
Any outcomes that you can point to yet, or is it still underway as far as determining how the species are being impacted?
Some of the research we can point to is specifically with spotted owls and seeing how they can thrive in some of these wildfire areas. So some positive research coming from that.
Now, Frank, you mentioned the return of the bighorn sheep. I guess fishers are doing better in the park. Some years ago, I think it was in the 70s, there was a story about national parks that were losing species, that were losing native species. And unfortunately, I can't recall it exactly, but I think Yosemite, I don't know if it was 25 or 30% of the native species were gone. Are you guys familiar with that research, and are there efforts underway to try and bring back some of those species? I mean, obviously the grizzly bear, I don't think many people in California want to see the grizzly bear back in Yosemite. I wouldn't mind it. I was just up in Yellowstone, and we had a grizzly bear come through our camp, and we didn't encounter it in the flesh, but it's always nice to know that they're out there.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that report, but it is, I mean, there has been habitat and loss and species lost over the years. And we're sort of trusting the park managers to come to us with, what's possible to make a difference as far as frogs or red foxes, things like that. How can we get in the sheep to bring them back? Yeah, it's a challenge. We did get a Yellowstone wolf down here earlier this summer. I don't know if you've heard about that. It was one of the Oregon wolves.
Yeah.
It was amazing that he passed through Yosemite and got as far as Monterey, California. I was last heard from over there. But we don't believe wolves were native to Yosemite, but it was interesting this guy made it that far south.
Yeah. Some years ago, I reported on a story that pikas, those small rodents that send out that high-pitched shriek of sorts when alarmed, were being forced up and out of their mountain habitats because of warming temperatures. But I guess there are more recent studies that show that's not necessarily true. Is that right, Cory?
Yeah, that's correct. In 2014 and 15, Yosemite Conservancy funded studies of climate change impacts on alpine ecosystems, basically through the lens of the American pika, specifically looking at food availability. And this was, building on a recently completed 5-year U.S. Geological Survey project focused on food availability in Yosemite for pikas. And the hypothesis was that with climate change, this is a species that's sort of at the top of the range in the alpine environments, and they wouldn't have habitat to go to any higher, and therefore could be a species of concern. Recent studies are showing that pikas are less vulnerable to climate change than originally hypothesized. So far, they can find basically micro habitats and microclimates in the alpine where they can stay cool and find adequate food. So, it's a species that's showing us, how some species can adapt to climate change, and maybe a lens on ourselves on how we might have to be adapting for climate change in the future.
Exactly. Now, I'm curious, you've got a wide range in elevation there at Yosemite. Is there any one part of the park that your work is more focused in terms of wildlife studies and research? Is the alpine area more of a concern than down low?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we focus a lot on the alpine because it is such, a unique environment, a unique life zone. Looking at these alpine plants that live at certain elevations, that have certain growing seasons, need certain climates. But then we also can look down at lower elevations, between 5,000 and 7,000 feet. This is the elevation that sees lots of wildfire, that's seeing drier environments. Climate change is affecting every life zone. So yeah, it's hard to say if we focus more on one life zone than another. I think we're looking at it all. Yosemite in our national parks, they're an exposed vein, if you will, of the earth that we're keeping a pulse of. Yosemite Conservancy donors and scientists and employees here, we're looking at every life zone and keeping a pulse and keeping a record of what is changing and how these ecosystems will be affected in the future with the ongoing human impacted climate change.
Frank, what do you find from your donors? I mean, do they have a particular niche they want to support?
Well, I think they are drawn to the charismatic species, and I think the park probably steers some grants our direction. They know that we might find appealing. One thing I'm just to piggyback on what Cory was saying is sort of the refugia and is the great gray owls, which is a species that's quite notable for Yosemite. We have the most significant population in the southern range of the great gray owl. So, just to give you a sense of the condition of Yosemite overall, we always hear about the crowds and how busy it is, but 97% of the park is wilderness. So, because most of the Sierra is national forest versus national park, and there's been a lot of logging, the last 30 years in the national forest, the next viable population of great gray owls out north of Yosemite is in Oregon. So, that just speaks about how important Yosemite is. And a few years ago, we were able to buy a 400-acre meadow, prime habitat for the great gray owls, right on the edge of the park boundary, near the Hetch Hetchy area of the park. And we were working with the Trust for Public Land. We were able to purchase that property and add it to the park. So it's basically a meadow, as you know, is like an oasis in the desert, and it's an oasis in the forest, really. But that's where the owls are. They're hanging out on the edge of that meadow, and we're actually taking on a big project in the next 3 years. The meadow had been grazed, but it was still, great habitat for owl hunting, but for owls to hunt. But it now will be restored. The meadow itself, which was impacted by cattle, will be also restored for hydrological reasons.
So, as far as your donors, do most of your funds come in with a specific project in mind, or do you get, hey, I'm going to give you guys money, you spend it the best way you think?
Ironically, it's mostly the latter, where people say, we like what you're doing. Please put my money to good use. We don't get a lot of sort of targeted donations. We get some from major donors that say, I really want to support this youth program, or I really want to help buy horses for the Ranger Patrol this summer. But that's actually more the exception than the rule. So we're fortunate that we have the flexibility from our donor base to put the money to use to that list of projects the park provides us.
Cory, you had mentioned the research in the alpine area of the park. Another story the Traveler reported on recently was how warming temperatures were affecting glaciers in national parks in the Pacific Northwest at Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Olympic, what have you. What about Yosemite's glaciers? I mean, I just drove through Grand Teton, and it seems that their glaciers are quickly disappearing. How are those in Yosemite faring?
Yeah, that's a great question. We looked at glaciers a lot for climate change and sort of indicators of climate change. And glaciers have been studied here in Yosemite for over 150 years. We've had famous naturalists like John Muir and Joseph LeConte, Francis Mathis, that have all studied glaciers here. And those glacial studies continue with help from Yosemite Conservancy. We have two glaciers in the park. There's the Lyell Glacier and the McClure Glacier. The Lyell Glacier is the largest in Yosemite and the second largest in the Sierra. And what we've seen in recent years from research from our park geologists and scientists here is that the Lyell Glacier has actually stopped growing. And a major definition of a glacier is that it has to grow. So therefore, the Lyell Glacier is no longer a glacier. So scientists are projecting that in the next 10 to 20 years that glaciers will completely disappear from Yosemite National Park.
Wow. When you say the Lyell Glacier is the largest in Yosemite, and I think you said the second largest in California, how many football fields is it?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I will say we do lead a trip every year, actually, through Yosemite Conservancy Outdoor Adventures up to the Lyell Glacier. You can go up and see the glacier for yourself and eye it out and see just the changes that are happening there. It's amazing to go and view it for yourself.
It's probably not that big, Kurt. It's probably a couple football fields now in size. It's really shrunken down. One of the things that we did find with the research was they found some of the early markers that John Muir had placed. He had put some wooden stakes on the Lyell Glacier and tried to see if it was going to move over time. And partly because of melting, but also just because, again, of the research went up there and looked at it more carefully, they actually found some of those original stakes that were still there.
Wow, that is amazing. We're running out of time, but one or two other things I wanted to touch on. You fund a lot of research in the park, both on climate change and other issues that come up. But education's also a big part of the work you guys do. I mean, as Cory said, taking out field trips, and Frank, you mentioned working with youth. I mean, that's a big part of your operation, right?
Oh, for sure. And Cory's our lead naturalist, and heads up our naturalist program where we do outdoor adventures, and these are like going on hikes with the experts that know the park like the back of their hand. But we also do programs. We fund programs primarily for youth to get them their first experience in the national parks like Yosemite. So probably almost $1 million a year of our grants to Yosemite go towards youth programs, and often they're to people of color and kids that have not had the opportunity to maybe go to visit a park on a summer vacation with a family. So we're really excited about supporting that kind of work, and it continues to grow. It is important, and it actually goes back to our early days. We were established in 1923 as the first nonprofit in National Park, and it was really established to build the Yosemite Museum, which is still in operation today, but also was to create educational programs. So we're still carrying on that flame today.
Along that line, I believe you're also helping out with the Bridal Veil Visitor Center.
Well, there's a couple projects. There's Bridal Veil Fall Restoration, which is the base of the falls. All the facilities there hadn't changed since the 1960s. So that is a $15 million project that we're working on. It's actually shared funding between the park and the Conservancy. So that is underway. The trail work is going to be wrapped up this fall, and the new restroom there with flush toilets for the first time and new signage and so forth will all be finished up early next year. So that's pretty exciting. And then the new Welcome Center in Yosemite Valley will be starting construction, or actually they'll start construction this fall. And that is basically they've consolidated a lot of the day use parking in Yosemite Valley to this one location. So the first building you encounter is this Welcome Center, and it's actually an existing building that's being rehabbed. It's an old retail store that was removed from the concession contract. So they'll rehab it into a visitor center, and we're excited to see. I just heard this morning that the bids came in at a reasonable number, which is always good to see in mountain construction.
It's kind of surprising in light of the lumber industry.
I know we're really surprised. We got a thumbs up this morning that it looks like it's a go. So we're happy about that.
That's great. Well, Frank and Cory, it's been great visiting with you and learning more about the good work you're doing on the ground there in Yosemite, and makes me want to plan a trip out there to go out in the field with you guys and see some of these things firsthand.
Great. Well, we'd love to have you come down, and we'll make sure we keep you posted on our progress on all these exciting projects.
Please do. Please do. We've been talking today with Frank Dean, President and CEO of the Yosemite Conservancy, and Cory Goehring, the Conservancy's lead naturalist. He's the guy who's going to take you out into the park and explain all the wonders that are to be beholden out there. Isn't that right, Cory?
That is correct.
All right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, and we'll look forward to catching up down the road to report on some of this research and some of those projects that you've got underway.
Sounds great. Thanks, Kurt.
All right. Thank you so much, Kurt.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. You can help the Yosemite Conservancy accomplish its mission at Yosemite National Park with a tax-deductible donation or by purchasing an item from their store. Visit the Conservancy at yosemite.org. Next week, Lynn Riddick will be visiting with the staff at George Washington Carver National Monument to learn more about that incredible agriculturalist, inventor, and humanitarian. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Rappencheck. See you in the parks.
Do you love one-click shopping? With our partner, Interior Federal Credit Union, you can earn rewards just by making online purchases. You're missing out on rewards points if you're not using their Visa, credit, and/or debit card. By adding these cards to your online shopping cart with Amazon, Walmart, or other shopping retailers, you can earn a point for every dollar you spend. Binge watching a lot with streaming services like Netflix and Hulu? Use their card for recurring payments to earn points as well. Visit their website, interiorfcu.org, and read their blog for more details and how to apply. Western National Parks Association is a nonprofit education partner of the National Park Service. WNPA supports parks across the West, developing products, services, and programs that enhance the visitor experience, understanding, and appreciation of national parks. Learn more at WNPA.org. The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the National Park System for decades to come. You can see their successes at gtnpf.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people, inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling national park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcast. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.